Okay. Okay. So the particular questions that I'm interested in my research are going to be that we're going to talk about today are this: what is the structure of spatial knowledge? Is it really like a map and sort of completely metrically accurate distances and angles like a map, like you might think, or is it something less, a little rougher and with some distortions? How can we learn new environments? So what are some of the mechanisms underlying learning? How does the human brain especially, track self-motion information, especially thinking about relationship to some of the animal models that we've seen in various ways? And then what are the sources of visual and body-based information that contribute to human path integration, which is this sort of movement in very sparse environments? And then finally, we're just going to talk a little bit about some of my recent research on looking at navigation abilities as we age, and hopefully making some connections with some of the Alzheimer's people here. So let's start with the structure of spatial knowledge. So there's several different types of spatial knowledge. So the first type, sort of basic type of spatial knowledge, is landmark information, which are just salient objects or locations that provide navigational clues and information. So this could be, like the sciences library, the anteater statue, something like that. But it could also be something more mundane, like a coffee shop, or a gas station, right? Or if you were in Rhode Island, which is where I went to grad school, people talk about where the gas station used to be, because things lasted a long time. So, anything that provides that information. The second type of spatial knowledge is route information, which is just a series of place action associations. And so my personal favorite story to talk about route knowledge is this time when my sister and I were in high school. My sister had just gotten her driver's license, and we went to visit my grandma, who lived about an hour and a half away. And this was before GPS systems. I don't think we even had a map or anything like that. So if you can imagine sending your teenage kids out nowadays without any of that stuff, my mom clearly really thought we had confidence in us, because all we really knew, though, is once we got off the highway, we go to the stoplight and turn left at that first stoplight. We go to the vegetable stand, turn right, go past the school, turn right again, cross the train tracks, and then we were at my grandma's house. So, if we had a detour or something, or if there had been road construction or a road closure, we might have really been in trouble because we wouldn't have been able to do anything else. But we did know the series of turns that we needed to take to get there. And then the sort of traditional final type of spatial knowledge is called survey knowledge, which is this true map-like knowledge of distances and angles. You can really, get a full, complete understanding of the environment. And it allows you to take shortcuts. So if you wanted to go from here at UCI to downtown Los Angeles, you could take a straight line arrow and go straight through and walk for 30 miles or whatever and get there. And this is really, you can imagine putting this into a Cartesian coordinate system and something very completely clear and perfectly metrically accurate and consistent. Now it seems like there's a pretty big gap there, if you might think, right, between taking routes where you just know the series of turns and sort of having a complete map. And sort of that's where the traditional series of spatial knowledge has been. But we're sort of proposing something new, which is called a graph. And so sort of an intermediate type of spatial knowledge. And a graph is a series of place edges, which are sort of locations, linked by path edges. And so you can think of that as, place nodes and path edges. And so you can think of that as sort of like the streets connecting places. And so this is an example of a graph. This is another example of a graph, and you might notice they're actually the same graph. So they both have the same sort of structure, this sort of triangle shape in the middle with a like hook on either side. So even though the distances and angles are different, the graph itself is the same. And the sort of classic example of a graph is a subway map. So again, for a subway system, you don't need to know all the twists and turns of the subway as it goes underneath the ground. You don't really need to know exactly how far the different stops are between each other. You just need to know that you take the red line to the green line, you change at Park Street, and then you go 4 more stops and you're, at City Hall. So, so that's sort of an perfect example of a topological graph. There's also something called a labeled graph, which contains some metric information. It might be coarse and contain biases. So for example, You might think of this as a 90-degree turn, even though it is not, but you might sort of regularize it to that. You might be able to say the relative distances between places. So it's not globally consistent, but it has a little bit of information. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but we've had some evidence suggesting that a labeled graph is the sort of dominant type of spatial knowledge that's acquired. And we're doing some tests on that now as well, so sort of examine this in more depth in various ways. One thing that's important to know, and sort of as we think about learning and different aspects of that, is that there's lots of different cognitive processes involved with these different types of spatial knowledge, and they don't all, apply to all types of spatial knowledge, and not all types of spatial knowledge need the same thing. And so, for example, everyone, you kind of need to know where you are, but you don't necessarily need, say, sequence learning to get the sort of full map of everything, right? You might just need that first sort of roots and graphs. But you do need, say, path integration, which is the updating of position and orientation during self-motion in order to learn distances and angles, but you might not need that for learning a route, for example. And so sort of understanding, how and why you need different types of cognitive information and abilities is going to be sort of critical to putting this all together. So let's then turn to how we can learn different environments. And so it seems really intuitive that active learning might be helpful, but what is active when it comes to navigation? And so it can mean actually a couple of things. So first, it could be physical activity, which is sort of your movement in different ways, all your body-based information. I'm actually going to talk about this in more depth a little bit later. But it could also be cognitive activity. And by that, I could mean a couple of things. So it could be the allocation of attention, so just focusing on particular aspects of the environment that are really important. It could be cognitive decision-making and sort of deciding how and where to explore. Do I want to turn left here? Do I want to turn right? What do I think I'm going to see there? It could also involve the mental manipulation of spatial information. So for example, here, this top figure is a set of objects here. And then one of these figures at the bottom is a rotated version. When it comes to navigation, that might mean something like when you're walking down the street, you know that you on your right-hand side, first you encounter a fire station and then a grocery store. So if you're coming back the other way, now those will be on your left, and first you'll have the grocery store and then the fire station. And so that sort of being able to make those transformations might also be really important. And so here is just an overview of some of the ways we've tested this question. And so we've tested this question of like, what is active and how does active navigation contribute to spatial learning by having participants learn a new environment. In this case, this is the overhead view of their environment that they were learning, which is a maze environment. This is what they were actually doing. They were walking around in a big empty room. So it's a virtual environment. It's immersive VR. So people can walk around, or in some cases, we had them just doing videos, depending on the experimental condition. So they can actually, fully experience everything. This is what it kind of looks like in the first person perspective. So we have some objects in the environment. So like this is the well, for example, this is the blue dot are objects. And these red rectangles are paintings on the wall, which serve as landmarks. And then in particular, I'm going to focus here on ability to take paths in the environment. So here I'm going to test whether or not you can learn the paths and sort of the connections between locations, which is that graph knowledge that I was talking about. So I'm just going to show you the test, which we call the shortest route test. So what we did was to test people's spatial knowledge, we dropped people off at one of the objects in the maze, in this case, the rabbit. And once they walked into that object, everything disappeared and all the objects turned into red blocks, so they wouldn't know where they were going. But then we asked them to go to another object in the maze. So in this case, we asked that person to go to the earth, which is here. And so this would be the sort of the correct trajectory to reach the earth. And then in the end, if they reached the target object correctly, they were counted as correct. And if they didn't or ended up somewhere else, they also could run out of time. It was incorrect. And so again, there's no feedback here. So they don't necessarily know that they've reached the right place because they're just going to the red square that they think is the right one. And so we tested this in a couple of different ways. So to understand the contributions of active learning. So in this situation, we had some people exploring the maze while walking, and some people were exploring using a video only, so reducing that body-based information. So they were just sitting and pressing buttons to get around. We also examined free decision-making versus guided decision-making. So in this case, some people were free to walk around, they could go wherever they wanted. But in the guided condition, we linked them by the elbow and sort of took them on a tour of the maze. And so they were guided in where they could go. They were walking, but they just couldn't make those decisions. And likewise, in the video condition, people in the guided video condition just watched the video of exploration. And so they really didn't get a lot of information about that. And so what we found in this case was that overall, we saw a main effect of decision-making. So people who were free to make decisions did much better than people who were guided. And that was sort of true regardless of whether it was walking or video, but even more so in the walking groups as well. Not to say that people who were guided didn't learn anything. This is the chance line. So people who were guided were well above chance, but people who were free to make decisions did much better. And there wasn't really a particular effect of walking in this particular case. For other types of spatial knowledge, there is effective walking, but I won't go into that now. But perhaps what is even more striking with this result is that we saw these incredible individual differences. And so this is sort of the data rearranged and looking at individual performance. And here I've arranged the data by the worst performing people on this end, so getting basically 0 or 1 question right, to 100% performance. And so these are the best performing individuals. And so you can see in both groups, there's this huge range. So it's just because you're being guided doesn't mean you can't do really well. And just because you are free to make decisions doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do well. But we see sort of everything in between, but there is this difference, this separation between the two groups sort of in the middle. And
Liz,
so that,
can I ask how old these people are?
these are all healthy young adults. So they're usually, I think they were about 18 to mostly 18 to 25.
There's a huge range of performance.
Huge range of performance. And these were also, I mean, these were Brown undergrads. So they were very motivated and very intelligent people generally. So they tend to be people who are really wanted to do well. I mean, we could tell some students were really frustrated that they weren't doing well. And so even so, there's this huge range. And, you know, there's lots of other, you know, they're very smart and capable people, but still not doing so great. And so we actually will have to adjust this even more if we start doing, you know, older groups and things like that, which we'll see later on. So, you know, understanding these individual differences has sort of gotten me motivated into some of our next set of studies. And so here's a study that we're doing now. We just finished doing data collection. We have about 100 young adults, again, doing this study. And here we're looking at those individual differences. And so this is what they're doing in the scanner. And so this is the task from a first person view. So we've modified it a little bit. So we've made it such that at each intersection, they just press an arrow key to say which direction they want to go. So so it eliminates some of the controller issues, which is something that we want to be particularly focused on if we're using an older population. So it's just very simple to do. It also comes in handy for another study, which I'll talk about in a minute. So we basically, again, just have people pressing buttons at each intersection, trying to find an object. Here they're going to an object. They did get it right. They're trying to go to the umbrella, which they did find. But again, it's just the red spheres in this case. So they don't necessarily know that they reached the right one. And so this is, you know, again, people are doing this, and we're looking at the brain dynamics of people doing this. So we've done both, looking at both brain structure, and so basic structural issues in terms of gray matter volume, but also white matter structure as well. We're also looking at then functional aspects, and so particularly looking at the connectivity between hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, and sort of striatal areas during this type of learning, which we think is going to be really important for learning in this situation. We're also investigating how different navigational abilities relate to each other. So navigation is probably not a singular entity, but it's composed of lots of different abilities. And so we're trying to understand the nature of those individual differences by sort of running this giant study of different ways that people can navigate, and then different sort of other abilities that might be beneficial, and then sort of looking at basic brain structure and function as well. And so we're in progress with that. It's sort of about to start we get some nice NSF funding for that from the Brain Initiative to do that. And then I'll tell you about another study in just a second, which is looking at EEG signal and the sort of understanding of theta oscillations and sort of what does that mean for active decision making in the brain. I guess first I just want to show a quick result from some of the white matter tracks. So we used diffusion spectrum imaging, which is a measure of white matter imaging, and just to kind of get a sense for in this case, again, this is sort of our 100-person study. Looks like we have about 85 in this particular, who've sort of completed everything. And we're seeing relationships in some of the areas that we were expecting with performance. And so some of the cingulate is a big area that's sort of especially connecting anterior cingulate with like hippocampal areas. Seems to be related to performance in the task, as well as some of our sort of cortical thalamic tracks that sort of go through thalamus and striatum that might be useful. So we're still investigating some of this, but we are sort of finding some white matter structure that is at least correlated with performance in the task in this younger adult population. So I just want to return then back to the question of these mechanisms. So we keep finding this active advantage. And now we're sort of wondering what are some of the mechanisms behind that, and how does it work? So in here, I want to sort of think about two sort of competing hypotheses. So the first hypothesis is attention. Perhaps people who were actively making decisions about where they wanted to go just had sort of greater arousal during the task, or they were paying attention to particular properties, and having the freedom to sort of choose where they wanted to go helped them pay more attention. But it could also be the case that there's sort of reinforcement learning mechanisms involved, where people are making little predictions about what they think they're going to see during exploration, and they get feedback on those predictions. So if they're exploring and they sort of come to an intersection and they say, I think the clock's going to be to my right if I go in there, then they turn and lo and behold, they see the clock. They get a little feedback signal telling them that they were correct, or if they were wrong, they get a feedback signal saying they were wrong, and getting some updates on that. So these sort of this is a possibility in terms of this learning. And so we're going to investigate that using EEG and theta oscillations. And so midfrontal theta oscillations have been linked to reinforcement learning mechanisms, as well as some cognitive control mechanisms. And so trying to understand what's going on there is going to be the focus of this study here. So our hypothesis is that the active decision makings are going to tap into those reinforcement learning mechanisms and will lead to this increase in midfrontal theta. But before we answer that question, we also have to answer an even more fundamental question about what is theta doing in navigation. And so sort of one of the dominant theories from the sort of animal literature side and from the sort of memory side, or sort of the navigation side, has been related to increased theta with movement speed. And so theta has been shown to increase, the theta oscillation power is shown to increase with movement speed. But sort of the memory side sort of says that it's more about active exploration of the environment and related to sort of encoding and retrieval dynamics with that. But when you think about it, those two possible roles are really confounded in most navigation tasks. So if you're exploring and you're moving, you're going to be having movement speed, and you're exploring, you're doing both at the same time. And if you're moving faster, you're getting more information about the environment and sort of encoding, have more opportunities to encode and learn. And so movement speed also goes in hand with active exploration. And so you can't really decouple that most of the time. But we are going to try to do that here. And so our hypothesis is that theta oscillations are actually related to this active exploration part and not the speed of movement. And so how are we going to test that? If it's related to movement, we'll see no differences in theta between the free and guided groups. But if it's related to active exploration, we'll see increased theta in the free group before they make their choices. So just to be clear here, we had some people who were free to explore, which is what I was showing you just a minute ago in the scanner. Now we're doing this in EEG. And the guided group just had to follow a path, follow the paths of the free group set. So they had to just sort of take the orange arrow that was the one that they were supposed to choose. And so in this case, as you saw in the video, people were stationary when they made their decisions. And so this was really a critical part of the design where when people are making their decisions, they're not moving. So we can decouple that speed question from the active explorations question. So as people are making their decisions, they're stationary, they can make a decision, speed's not involved. So there's this equivalence across the free and guided group. So now we're only seeing changes in the free group. So we're hoping to see those changes in the free group compared to the guided group if it's related to exploration. If it's speed, we won't see a difference. And then again, related to the mechanism, if it's reinforcement learning, we'll see this increased theta power in midfrontal areas. If it's something like attention, we might see it in parietal areas, or we might see other frequency bands like alpha or something like that. So what we found is during this exploration period, we found that there was indeed a large theta power in midfrontal channels in the free group just prior to making their decision. So sort of between -300 and 0 milliseconds in that sort of window just prior to the decision point. The guided group had some, but there was a significant reduction in theta power, theta oscillations for that guided group compared to the free group. We also saw some interesting effects during the testing phase as well. I'm happy to answer questions about that. But again, we saw this big drop in these midfrontal channels as we were expecting during that critical decision-making moment. And so this suggests that theta is in the free group is consistent with active exploration, not movement speed. And it's consistent with reinforcement learning mechanisms because it's in that sort of midfrontal channel area. So we're starting to get some understanding of these mechanisms of free exploration and why learning is important and how the learning process is happening. But there's still a long way to go. And we're sort of learning more and more about that, and so we're continuing to process this data about it. But I'm going to move on next to talking about how the human brain tracks self-motion information and sort of thinking about that in different ways. And so this is going to relate to sort of shifting gears here to talk about path integration. And here we're going to talk about this continuous updating of position and orientation in an environment. And we usually think of this in sort of a desert environment and thinking about places without landmarks where you're really reliant on your own self-motion and not the sort of external world. And so this can mean a lot of different things. So it could mean complex behaviors like tracking a location where you have to go on a complex outbound path and then return back to the place you started. It could also mean simpler types of spatial movement, such as translation in a straight line or rotation in place. So just understanding basic building blocks here, how far you traveled, how far you turned. So all that's part of path integration as well. And so we've done a lot of studies on path integration of various kinds. This is a type of environment that we use for path integration, typically sort of a virtual desert or a virtual hallway. So it's not as exciting perhaps for some of our participants to be in some of the studies where we have just these virtual hallways, but it is really important and it does actually help. This is where we use virtual reality to sort of remove things in the world and make sort of things simpler rather than to sort of build these complicated mazes. And so I want to talk about, in particular, two models of path integration and sort of how they've been studied and sort of where we're thinking about them. So our first model of path integration is called a configural model, also perhaps called an accumulator model, where you're accumulating information about the entire outbound path. And then at the end of that trajectory, you will compute a homebound return trajectory. So you kind of do a little trigonometry, sort of figure out where you've been, how far did I turn, how far did I go? Okay, now here's how I get back. The other model of path integration is called a homing vector model, where you track the trajectory back to the home location during the entire outbound path. So this is sort of history free. You don't need to remember anything about the outbound path in particular. You just need to know where you are relative to home. And so you're sort of every step you're updating that homebound trajectory. And so these are very different in terms of how they're sort of computed and conceptualized. There's some evidence that we can do both when necessary, but we are going to focus in particular on the homing vector model just because most models and most thoughts about path integration, both from the human side and the animal research, have really focused on that configural bit. And so now we're going to start thinking about this homing vector just to see if we can sort of see if there's other evidence for that in the world. So first we'll do a little behavioral study just to see whether home is special. So the homing vector model would predict that you have greater accuracy in tracking the home location than other locations, right? Because you're constantly homing, you're keeping track of where you are relative to home. You actually don't really care about anything else. So if you have, if you're trying to return to home, you will do better than something else. So home would be special. If you are thinking about the configural model, then the home is not special. You can do be just as accurate to any location, right? Because you're tracking how you moved in the world, and now you can just update the sort of configuration of where everything is and just sort of do the trig and figure it out. And so this predicts that home is not special and there's really no difference. And so what we did was we tested homing versus not homing, basically. And in particular, we tested homing versus a mirror location. And so this equates what we call the execution error, which is a significant source of error. So if you go on a triangle, so it's a typical task is a triangle completion task where you go out on a first leg of a path, you go on a second leg, and you're asked to complete the triangle to go home. But if instead you ask people to basically do the same thing that you would do, but go to a mirror location. And so just walk the same distance, turn the same distance, but just the other way and do this. So the mirror location is different. So if that's the case, we can contrast these two locations. So we predict if home is special, we would see lower errors and reduced variability in the home condition compared to the mirror condition. So we've equated how far you have to turn and walk during your homebound trajectory, which is a significant source of error. And now instead we just say, is it just going home or not? And what we did find is that home is special. So we found that that the errors really did differ between the conditions, and that the mirror condition was more variable. So we look at the mean. So this is position error, which is just the straight line distance from where the target was, either home or mirror, versus where they ended. So how far off were you in hitting that target? And overall, there were certainly some areas, in particular certain trial types, where people were more accurate in getting to the home location. These are box plots, so these are the medians here. And in overall, because we had several trials of each one, we found that people were more precise in the home condition than in the mirror condition. So they tended to be less variable in their choice, in their sort of ending points, whereas the mirror condition, they sort of ended up all over the place. In the home condition, they were more consistent. This is also true for distance error, so how far they walked on that final leg. They tended to overshoot the home condition and undershoot the mirror condition. So there were differences. We can't necessarily say one is more accurate than the other, but we can definitely say that they were different. But we can also look at their standard deviations, which again is that measure of variability. And again, we see that the mirror condition is more variable than the home condition overall. So this suggests that home is special in some way, and that there might be something about homing. So this is providing some evidence for the homing vector model. But we can also look at the homing vector model from a brain perspective. And so looking at whether or not there are brain areas that are sensitive to this sort of tracking of distance from home or where you are relative to your home position, rather than say the position you are on a trajectory. And so what we did here was a task called the loop closure task, which we'll see again in a little bit. But the loop closure task basically says, it's very simple. We're going to take you in a circle and let us know if we ended in the same place you started. So when you finish the circle, you might either return back to the start location, which we call the match, or you might have just go partway around, which is called a mismatch, or you might go all the way around and past, which is also a mismatch because you ended somewhere else. You didn't end up in the same place that you started. And so this task, basically, in the scanner, what we did was had people watch videos of this and then ask them whether it returned to the same place it started. And so the videos were done in this sort of really sparse environment. It moves very quickly. It's hard to really get your bearings in terms of like trying to anchor any of the visual information. Really, all you can do is just keep track of how fast and how far you've moved. And so what we found was indeed there were areas that were sensitive to this homing signal. And so what's one of the neat properties of a circle is that as you go away from home, you have a further and further Euclidean distance. But as you start to return on the circle, this distance gets smaller. So this is what a sine wave is, basically, right? So as you go further out and you come back, you see this sort of change in your straight line distance from home. Now, what we did here was we also actually were able to break that apart for some other things, because we had several different size circles, so we could actually determine whether it was Euclidean distance from home or whether it was being at that sort of 180-degree mark. And we actually found these areas were more sensitive to the straight line distance from home than to that sort of degrees from home mark. And so these are areas that are really tracking distance. And what we found was, in particular, areas like the hippocampus, anterior hippocampus in this case, retrosplenial cortex, parahippocampal cortex, as well as angular gyrus. So a lot of our default mode areas were really important for this and showed this strong signal that we're tracking this Euclidean distance from home. So again, this is some evidence supporting this homing vector system, sort of consistent with the idea of a homing vector signal in the brain, in particular in this hippocampal and retrosplenial area. And again, this is a very different sort of model than many of the animal models have been working on. So we're hoping this provides some new directions for that. We also saw individual differences here. So as we had seen individual differences in other cases, we found that as well. So we found some gray matter volume correlations with this. So better performance in this loop closure task was associated with increased gray matter volume in hippocampus, retrosplenial, and medial prefrontal cortex. We also saw some differences in terms of connectivity. So using the resting state data. So when your brain is at rest, we could look at some of the basic functional networks, and we saw how there was some connections between sort of hippocampus and entorhinal cortex, which are these critical, metric-based navigation areas, and how those are related with some of the canonical networks. I also saw this in a simpler task. So not just this homing signal, though, we also saw that these same areas, hippocampal, retrosplenial, parahippocampal cortex, were also really important for tracking straight line distance. So just distance in a line and sort of how far you went. They were also important for tracking rotation in place. So these were all really key areas for thinking about how we could encode distances in different ways. Even though they're not, like, rotation in place is not really a distance per se, it's stationary, but it seems to be important for sort of tracking whatever's important. So it's sort of leading to this question of flexible encoding in the hippocampus. And sort of perhaps there's some task dependency in thinking about what might be important. So as we move forward and thinking about where we're going next with this question, we've seen this sensitivity to Euclidean distance from home, as I mentioned before, but we also saw this sensitivity to translation rotation. But putting this together, we can also think about how hippocampus has been shown to show sensitivity to time. And there's sort of these time cells in animals that have been found in various ways. And so, it leads to the question, excuse me, whether the hippocampus is sensitive to multiple types of relational processing, right? So is it sensitive to thinking about time and distance and rotation and translation in lots of different ways in sort of a task-dependent manner? There's also been some evidence in the literature thinking about social distance. And so, we're currently looking at this and thinking about whether spatial, temporal, and social distances are all involved. And so what I'm showing you here is sort of a little town that we've been making with lots of sort of different characters in the town, and thinking about their different social relationships, but there's also a spatial sense here too, because there's some sort of a map of the town. Things are different distances apart. There's time elements as well. And so here we're trying to sort of piece this apart and sort of create a system that can sort of answer some of those questions. So that's where this project is moving forward. Okay, I'm running out of time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about self-motion and talk about path integration from a slightly different perspective, thinking about how fast you're moving, thinking about cues for self-motion. So there's lots of different cues. Again, as I mentioned, there's vision, there's proprioception, there's motor efference, there's vestibular information, so all this different information that we have. And so what we're going to do here is the loop closure task, but in a behavioral manner. But then now we're going to contrast different sources of input that we might have. So we are going to look at walking with vision, which is just sort of our standard virtual desert. We're going to put people in a wheelchair to take away their walking. And so comparing walking wheelchair with vision, so they still have vision. Walking without vision, which is sort of a blackened out version of that. So there's no texture environment, it's just a black screen. And wheelchair with no vision. So that's really just a vestibular only situation. So here it's the same task. It's the loop closure task, but now they're walking. So now we have the experimenter walking them in a circular path. And then the participant just tells us when they think they've returned back to their home location. So they could overshoot or undershoot, and that's up to them. We can see how far off they are in this situation. So this is what it looks like in the environment. So this is our experimenter walking someone around in the loop closure task. And this is what it looks like from the participant's perspective. It's not a lot to see because it's a virtual desert. And that orange pole is their start location. That's the place that they have to track. It disappears once they walk into it, so they can never see it again. So it's just sort of an anchor, but there's no visual information about it later on. So what we found here is looking at our primary outcome measure was looking at the home location and degrees traveled. And so how far did they overshoot or undershoot? And so here we found that there was a sort of a signal, the walking with vision group was the best, of course. They got closest to 360 degrees. The vestibular only walking, the wheelchair without vision was the worst, but the other two conditions sort of made similar contributions in the middle. We can also see this for people who are interested in Bayesian EQ combination. We did some of that. We found that people didn't combine ideally, but overall we found that really these two conditions seem to really be independent, so that we found that walking made its own contribution and vision made its own contribution, and sort of they both sort of did something in the middle if you had one cue versus both versus neither. Interestingly, compared to people's self-reports, people reported that vision was really important, that it was much easier if they had vision, even though in fact the vision condition, if it was a single cue, was sort of in between. So even though these were different in terms of their ratings, their performance was actually very similar on these two conditions. So your sort of internal feelings about how things are going may not necessarily match up. I want to talk then a little bit about how we think about navigation and sort of some of these other fundamental pieces involved with path integration. And so this is something my student is currently working on. And so understanding about travel trajectory. So now we're really getting even further into the building blocks and basics of navigation and sort of these basic building blocks of path integration. So when computing a travel trajectory, your brain needs to know lots of different information. So a trajectory is sort of a distance, which is we think of as like rate times time, right? Speed times time is distance. But velocity is a vector, so you need the direction that you're traveling in order to get this all together. So these are the real things that you need to in order to form a trajectory. And so we're going to be in the future, we're going to look more at speed and time. Right now, we're looking at travel direction in general, and sort of thinking about this as an overlying process of going from these really low level building blocks to these sort of higher representations. But what's interesting is that most of what people have been studying is head direction. So a lot of the animal work has really focused on head direction, but travel direction from first principles is really a fundamentally different concept than head direction. So head direction is the direction you're facing, whereas travel direction is the sort of direction of the center of your velocity. So this is an example of rodents and how they differ in their head direction and travel direction, right? Your head direction may be going to the side as you're moving forward, or you might be sort of turning this way and then looking that way as you move around. And so you can see that there's quite a difference between their travel direction and head direction as you sort of go through time here. So we've seen a lot of head direction cells in animals, in thalamus, presubiculatum, retrosplenial, entorhinal, but we haven't really been able to piece apart travel direction. It hasn't just been studied in very great detail, but in addition, a few people have looked and haven't found any signals. But we're trying to do that in humans with this current study. So what we're trying to do here is use a visual adaptation paradigm, where we look at the sensitivity of this change when you're exposed to a new stimulus, which gives you a lingering after effect. So the traditional one is sort of looking at a red scene for a few minutes, and you look at a white wall and you see something green. So the sort of red-green after image opponent process. You can also see movement in a downward trajectory. And then if you sort of look at a white wall, you'll see movement in an upward trajectory. And so that's sort of another after effect and after image. So we're trying to do this adaptation paradigm, but with something that happens over an extended amount of time and looking at travel trajectory. So what we're doing is having an adaptation phase where people are moving down this virtual hallway. And again, it's not the most exciting study to be a participant in, but basically people move for a minute down this hallway towards the sun direction. And we go down this towards the sun direction. On the opposite end is the moon direction. But as you can see, occasionally we have these flips. So the head direction flips. And so you're half the time you're facing the sun, half the time you're facing the moon on average. But your travel direction is always going towards the sun. And so you're traveling towards the sun, traveling towards the sun, traveling towards the sun for a minute, you get an adaptation to that sun direction, but your facing is different. And so that's always moving around. And then during the test phase, when the hallway turns green, now you move back and forth between the sun and the moon. And here you're asked at the end of the test phase, whether you moved more towards the sun or more towards the moon during that test phase. And that's your test. And so, and then you do these sort of adaptation, these brief adaptation moments, and then you go back and forth between adaptation and test throughout. And so what we're hoping here is to see an adaptation effect where, given that you've been traveling towards the sun, you'd sort of see this return back towards sort of saying that you traveled towards the moon during the test phase. And we have a control. So we're comparing this to a control with no adaptation, where they just sort of sit still for that adaptation time. They flip around, but there's no head direction changes. And so our prediction here is that this is what they would look like in the control. You'd sort of see this nice curve where 50% actual movement is related to 50% perceived movement. But then if we do movement in the sun direction, we would see a shift of this curve over, so that you'd see sort of a change in where 50% is. We also did this with a condition traveling to the moon direction, just to sort of prevent any response bias towards the sun. So we did this in the other direction as well. So we should see these sort of two shifts away from the control condition. And we do start to see that. So we do see some evidence for that. So we see in the sun condition, there's some shifting over here. It's subtle, but it's there. There's also some overall shifting in the moon condition, although it's not as strong. Although if you notice, this is actually in the opposite direction of what we might expect. So they're shifting, but they're actually shifting in the direction towards the adaptation direction. And so that's something that we're still trying to piece about why that might be. But we're definitely seeing some effects here that suggest that there's some adaptation to this travel direction, and that there's some sense of what's happening with the travel. Okay, so I know we're wrapping up on time. I just want to go briefly and talk a little bit about some of our latest directions in the lab and thinking about navigation abilities as we age. And so when you think about this, it's really important from a human health standpoint. So what's sort of exciting to be working about in the field of navigation right now is that it's emerged as this early marker for detecting people at risk for dementia in a couple of different ways. Usually people who have the sort of genetic predisposition, but hopefully also sort of the more spontaneous development of Alzheimer's as well and other dementias. So another key factor here is that women have twice the risk for dementia than men. So that's something that's going to be important to think about. But then sort of connecting these two is that there's been these big sex differences in navigation have frequently been observed. We don't necessarily know the sort of origins of them, and they're sort of mixed. And sometimes you see them, sometimes you don't, and sort of understanding the nature of those sex differences hasn't been fully understood, but they are sort of frequently observed, and it's important to get to the sort of bottom of that. And so we're wondering if there's these connections here. And especially when you think about the fact that sex hormones influence the organization of the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, especially, which are these huge areas for navigation. And so if the hippocampus is affected by estrogen receptors, or there's a huge amount of estrogen receptors in the hippocampus, then that's probably going to have some sort of effect on learning and memory processes, and in particular, navigation ability. And so sort of putting that together, I've been working with some collaborators on a reproductive aging task. And so, well, first of all, we're looking both just in terms of looking at aging in the very earliest stages of aging. So instead of sort of saying 65 and older is our arbitrary aging cutoff, we're looking a little bit earlier. So we're looking at the 45 to 55 year age range, which is earlier than people have been looking for a lot of stuff. But then most critically, it's also the time when women go through menopause. So there's this huge change in sex hormones during the menopausal transition. And so we can piece apart chronological aging and reproductive aging with this. So we had participants do 3 different tasks. I'm not going to talk about the hormone levels right now because we haven't finished that part up, but we've done the behavioral study just looking at the age and sex differences. We have that loop closure task, which I showed you before. We have the maze learning task, which I think I'd also showed you before. We also have a task which is looking at strategy, use, and decisions there. And so what we found here is that the path integration task didn't really show many differences between men and women or aging. So the women tended to overshoot and men tended to undershoot, but they were actually overall equally as accurate. So there were some differences there, but they weren't really substantial in terms of performance. What we did see performance differences were in the other tasks. So in the maze task, first of all, there's an enormous sex difference in the younger adults. It kind of goes away in the midlife adults. The women didn't have much room to go down, but the men really actually decreased. So again, it's our 45 to 50 year olds really showed a pretty massive reduction in performance in that task. In our strategy task, we also saw these pretty large sex differences and age differences as well. So we did see some significant reductions in performance. We also saw that the sort of midlife groups tended to use paths that they already knew rather than sort of taking new paths, as did the younger women. So we are definitely seeing some early signs of aging in this group. And then finally, just something else that got me interested. So we're doing this study looking at sex hormones in the brain and all these sorts of things. I was wondering, and as I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, I had a baby last year. How does the maternal brain change during pregnancy? And we have very little information on human neuroscience, not that much even in animal work, but almost nothing in the human side. So we did some high temporal density scanning on a single participant, which was me. So I went into the scanner during the entirety of my pregnancy every couple of weeks and did some basic structure, some basic function, and some spectroscopy to look for metabolite differences. So we're still wrapping that up. We have the blood hormones, the hormone levels and gene expression information that we're sort of still processing through all that stuff. But just to get a sense for what is happening and how does the brain change during this really, again, another significant time in a woman's life, in some women's life where they have this enormous thing. So I have a nice, happy, healthy 9-month baby. He's the cutest. I also apparently have a very significantly reduced hippocampal gray matter volume as well. So just to show you this pretty solid decline, and we'll see if it goes back up, but it's not looking good. So with that, I just want to summarize. What's that?
Scale on that change in your own brain? I mean, is that over 9 months you had that?
That's over 9 months, yeah. It's sort of pre and then sort of over most of it. It's not quite the whole time. I don't think we have the last couple of data points in there, but yeah.
So that's during pregnancy.
Yep, and then we're continuing to get some data for like a year out to see if it's how long lasting it is. It may not change your behavior, but that's what we're seeing so far. So just to summarize everything, we looked at different types of spatial knowledge. We looked at learning. We looked at tracking self-motion and the sources of information during path integration. And then we looked at a lot of different ways that people might differ in their individual abilities. So thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it. These are some collaborators. These are funding. And again, I really appreciate your questions and input. I know we don't have much time.